The rain hammered against the window panes like 1,000 desperate fists, each drop echoing the turmoil that churned inside 12-year-old Marcus's chest. Thunder rolled across the darkened sky, a celestial mirror to the storm brewing inside the small house on Maple Street. He pressed his face against the cold glass, watching rivulets of water race down the surface, wondering if his tears would fall as freely if he let them. Behind him, the kitchen table sat like an altar of silence. 3 chairs, 3 plates, 3 separate worlds that had never quite learned to orbit together. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds with mechanical indifference, measuring time that felt both endless and fleeting in this house that had never truly become a home. It had been 2 years since his mother's laughter had filled these rooms, 2 years since her gentle hands had smoothed his hair and whispered bedtime stories that could chase away any nightmare. Now, in her place, sat Eleanor, his stepmother, a woman whose love seemed to come wrapped in rules and expectations, bound tight with invisible wire that cut deeper the more he struggled against it. His father, David, had introduced Eleanor with the careful enthusiasm of a man trying to rebuild something he wasn't sure how to construct in the first place. "She'll be good for us," he had said, his eyes holding a hope so fragile that Marcus had been afraid to breathe too hard in its presence. "We need someone to help us remember how to be a family." But families, Marcus had discovered, weren't built on need. They grew from something deeper, something that couldn't be legislated or arranged. Eleanor had arrived with her own 8-year-old daughter, Lily, a quiet girl with curious eyes who seemed to understand the unspoken language of their new family dynamics better than any of them. She was the daughter Eleanor's first marriage had given her, and the daughter she protected with the fierce intensity of someone who had already lost too much. The early months had been a careful dance of politeness and tentative gestures. Eleanor would pack his lunches with military precision, ensuring he had everything he needed, but somehow missing the small touches his mother had included, the silly notes, the extra cookie, the way she had cut his sandwiches into shapes that made him smile. When he tried to thank her, Eleanor would nod briskly and move on to the next task, efficiency masking whatever emotions lay beneath. Dinners became exercises in careful conversation, each of them navigating around subjects that might disturb the delicate peace they had constructed. His father would ask about school, Eleanor would inquire about homework, and Lily would quietly eat while stealing glances at Marcus, as if trying to solve some complicated equation. The silence between words grew heavier with each passing day, filled with all the things they couldn't or wouldn't say. Marcus found himself caught in a web of competing loyalties, love for his father, grief for his mother, and confusion about where Eleanor fit in the landscape of his heart. She wasn't cruel exactly, but she wasn't warm either. She was like a guardian angel made of ice, protective but untouchable, caring but cold. The first crack in their fragile foundation had come on a Tuesday evening in October. Marcus had been reaching for a glass of water when his elbow caught the edge of Eleanor's favorite teacup, a delicate thing painted with tiny blue flowers that she had inherited from her grandmother. The sound of it shattering against the kitchen floor seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. "That was my grandmother's," Eleanor had said, her voice tight with something that might have been grief or anger or both. "She gave it to me before she died." "I'm sorry," Marcus had stammered, dropping to his knees to gather the pieces. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident." "Accidents," Eleanor had replied, her words measured and sharp, "still have consequences." His father had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of breaking china and rising tension. His eyes had moved between his son and his wife, and Marcus had seen the exact moment when David made his choice. "Marcus, you need to be more careful. Eleanor's things aren't toys." The words had hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have, not because they were harsh, but because they revealed a truth he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. In this new family, he was no longer the priority. He was a complication to be managed, a variable in an equation that would be easier to solve without him. The second fracture had come during Lily's birthday party. Eleanor had spent weeks planning every detail: streamers and Lily's favorite colors, a cake decorated with the characters from her beloved books, games that would delight a room full of 8-year-old girls. Marcus had helped where he could, wanting to be part of the joy that seemed to flow so naturally around his stepsister. But when it came time for presents, when Lily had opened gift after carefully wrapped gift, Marcus had realized with growing horror that his own present was missing from the pile. He had saved his allowance for months to buy her a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook, knowing how much she loved to draw. He had wrapped it himself and placed it on Eleanor's dresser that morning, along with all the other gifts. "Where's my present for Lily?" he had whispered to Eleanor during a lull in the festivities. Eleanor had looked at him with genuine confusion. "What present?" "The art supplies. I put them on your dresser this morning." Her expression had shifted from confusion to something harder. "Marcus, I don't know what you're talking about, and this isn't the time for make-believe." The words had landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of humiliation through Marcus's chest. Around them, children laughed and played, but he felt suddenly invisible, erased from a moment that should have included him. Later, he had found his carefully wrapped gift exactly where he had left it, hidden behind a jewelry box on Eleanor's dresser. Whether she had genuinely forgotten or simply chosen not to see it, the result was the same. He didn't matter enough to be remembered. The final break had come 3 weeks later, on a gray November morning when the world seemed wrapped in cotton and shadows. Eleanor had discovered that $20 was missing from her purse, money she had set aside for Lily's school fundraiser. The accusation hadn't been spoken directly, but it had hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell but no one wanted to acknowledge. "I know things have been hard," Eleanor had said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to be reasonable. "Sometimes when we're feeling left out or angry, we make choices that don't reflect who we really are." "I didn't take your money," Marcus had said, his voice cracking with the strain of holding back tears. "The money was there yesterday, and now it's gone. Lily wouldn't take it, and your father and I certainly didn't." The logic was implacable, the conclusion foregone. Marcus had stood there, feeling the walls of his world closing in around him, understanding with crystal clarity that no amount of protestation would change the equation that had already been solved in Eleanor's mind. His father, when presented with the situation, had simply looked tired. "Just give back the money, son. We won't talk about it anymore." But Marcus hadn't taken the money, and the injustice of being blamed for something he hadn't done felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. That night, as rain began to fall against his bedroom window, he had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He couldn't stay in a house where he was presumed guilty, where his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, where love felt like a finite resource that had to be carefully rationed. He was 12 years old, and he was going to run away. The backpack had been easy to pack. A few clothes, the last picture he had of his mother, the pocket knife his grandfather had given him, and $43 in birthday money he had been saving. He had written a note trying to explain what couldn't really be explained and left it on his pillow where someone would eventually find it. He had written, "I'm sorry I'm such a problem. Maybe you'll be happier without me." And now, as thunder crashed overhead and rain turned the world into a watercolor painting running with tears, Marcus stood at the front door with his hand on the handle. This was it. The moment of no return, the step that would carry him away from everything he had known into something vast and unknowable. He thought of his mother, wondering if she would approve of this choice, or if she would wrap him in her arms and tell him that families were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. He thought of his father, probably asleep upstairs next to Eleanor, unaware that his son was about to walk out of his life. He thought of Lily, who had never asked for a broken older brother, but had accepted him with a grace that shamed him. The door opened with a whisper of hinges, and the night air rushed in to embrace him like a long-lost friend. The rain was cold against his face, each drop a small baptism washing away the last of his childhood innocence. He stepped into the storm, pulling his hood up against the deluge, and began to walk toward whatever waited for him in the darkness. Behind him, the house sat quiet and still, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that made it look like a haven he would never again be able to claim. He didn't look back. Looking back, he had learned, only made leaving harder. The street stretched before him like a river of possibilities, each streetlight a lighthouse guiding him toward a future he couldn't imagine, but somehow knew he had to find. He was 12 years old, and he was running away from the only family he had left, carrying nothing but his wounded pride and the stubborn hope that somewhere in the world there was a place where he could belong. The storm swallowed him whole, and Maple Street returned to its peaceful slumber, never knowing that one of its children had just stepped across the threshold into a larger, colder world. The rain showed no mercy. It poured down with the relentless fury of a sky that had been holding its breath too long, transforming familiar streets into alien waterways that reflected the orange glow of streetlights like scattered coins on dark velvet. Marcus had been walking for what felt like hours, though the grandfather clock in his abandoned home had only counted 47 minutes since he'd closed the door behind him. His sneakers squelched with each step, waterlogged canvas clinging to his feet like the weight of his decision. The backpack, once light with possibility, now felt like it carried stones instead of clothes. Water had found its way through every seam, every zipper, turning his carefully packed belongings into sodden reminders of the life he was trying to leave behind. But it was the cold that surprised him most. Not the physical chill that made his fingers numb and his breath visible in small puffs of vapor, but the emotional cold that seemed to be seeping into his bones from someplace deeper than weather could reach. For the first time since he'd made his decision, doubt began to whisper in his ear like a persistent ghost. Where exactly was he going? The question had seemed less important when he was standing in his bedroom, fueled by righteous anger and wounded pride. Now, as he passed the third block of darkened houses where normal families slept safely behind locked doors, the reality of his situation began to settle like sediment in still water. He was a 12-year-old boy alone in a storm with less than $50 and no plan beyond the desperate need to be anywhere but home. The first person he encountered was Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived 2 streets over and was apparently returning from a late shift at the hospital where she worked as a janitor. She emerged from the bus stop shelter like a figure from a dream, her small frame bundled in a yellow raincoat that made her look like a bright flower blooming in the darkness. "Child, what are you doing out here?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and wasn't easily fooled by stories. "It's past midnight, and this storm is getting worse." Marcus paused, water dripping from his hood as he considered his options. He could tell her he was fine, that he was just heading home from a friend's house. He could make up some story about an emergency that required him to be out in the storm. Or he could tell her the truth, that he was running away from a family that didn't want him, into a night that offered no promises. "I'm going to visit my aunt," he said finally, the lie slipping out with surprising ease. "She lives across town." Mrs. Chen studied him, with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize pain when it stood shivering before her. "Does your aunt know you're coming? In the middle of the night? In a storm?" The questions hung in the air between them like accusations. Marcus felt his carefully constructed story beginning to crumble under the weight of adult logic and genuine concern. "She's expecting me," but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. Mrs. Chen stepped closer, and he could smell the hospital disinfectant that clung to her clothes, mixed with the scent of rain and something that might have been kindness. "What's your name, child?" "Marcus." The truth slipped out before he could stop it. "Marcus what?" He hesitated. Giving his last name would make him findable, traceable, returnable to a life he was trying to escape. But something in Mrs. Chen's voice, a gentleness that reminded him achingly of his mother, made him want to trust her. "Henderson," he whispered. Recognition flickered across her features. "Henderson? You're David Henderson's boy, aren't you? The one who married Eleanor Walsh?" The net was tightening around him. In a town this size, everyone knew everyone else's business, and running away was a luxury that required anonymity he didn't possess. "I have to go," Marcus said, backing away from her concerned gaze. "My aunt is waiting." But Mrs. Chen wasn't easily dismissed. "Marcus, sweetheart, whatever's wrong at home, this isn't the answer. You're going to catch your death out here, and there are people who love you who are probably worried sick." "No one's worried," Marcus said. The bitterness in his voice surprised them both. "No one even knows I'm gone." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Marcus saw understanding dawn in Mrs. Chen's eyes. She had worked with enough broken families to recognize the signs of a child who felt invisible in his own home. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "that's not true. I promise you, that's not true." But Marcus was already moving, backing away into the rain and the darkness, afraid that if he stayed another moment, Mrs. Chen's kindness would crack the careful shell he had built around his resolve. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing off wet pavement as he put distance between himself and the first person who had shown him genuine concern in months. The running felt good at first, liberating, purposeful, like he was finally taking control of his destiny. But his legs were short, his lungs were small, and the rain was relentless. Within 2 blocks, he was gasping for breath, his side aching with the sharp pain that comes from pushing too hard too fast. He slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely, leaning against a lamppost while he tried to catch his breath. The metal was cold against his palm, and he could feel the vibration of electricity humming through the wires overhead. Power lines connecting house to house, family to family, creating a network of belonging that he felt utterly cut off from. This was when the doubt really began to take hold. Standing there in the pool of artificial light, watching the rain create tiny rivers in the gutters, Marcus started to replay the evening's events with the cruel clarity that comes from distance and desperation. Had he really tried to work things out with Eleanor? Had he made any effort to understand her perspective, or had he simply cataloged every slight and disappointment like evidence in a case he was building against her? The questions felt like tiny knives, cutting into the righteousness that had sustained him through those first blocks. He remembered the night after the teacup incident, when he had found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, staring at the glued-together pieces she had tried to reassemble. There had been something broken in her posture, something that suggested the cup meant more to her than he had understood. He had watched from the doorway, unseen, as she traced the crack lines with her fingertip, and for a moment, she had looked less like the stern stepmother who corrected his behavior, and more like a woman trying to hold together something precious that kept threatening to fall apart. He thought about Lily's birthday party and the gift that had been forgotten on the dresser. Eleanor had been coordinating games and cutting cake and making sure every child felt included, a massive undertaking that would have overwhelmed him completely. Was it possible that in the chaos of managing 8 excited children, she had simply forgotten? Was it possible that the slight he had felt so deeply had been nothing more than human error rather than deliberate exclusion? And the missing money, $20 that could have gone anywhere, could have been misplaced or spent and forgotten by anyone in the house. He had been so quick to take offense, so ready to see malice where there might have been simple mistake. But taking offense had felt safer than considering the alternative, that Eleanor might genuinely care about him, but simply didn't know how to show it. The rain was getting heavier, if that was possible. It fell in sheets now, turning the world into a watercolor painting where edges blurred and details dissolved. Marcus pulled his hood tighter and tried to wipe the water from his eyes, but it was a losing battle. Everything was wet, everything was cold, and the romantic notion of running away was steadily being eroded by the practical reality of being a child alone in a storm. He had made it perhaps 10 blocks from home when the headlights appeared behind him. At first, they were just distant stars in the darkness, but they grew steadily brighter and closer until Marcus could hear the rumble of an engine and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. His heart began to race, not with excitement, but with fear he hadn't anticipated. In all his planning for this dramatic exit, he hadn't really considered that the world outside his family might be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with emotional rejection. The car slowed as it approached him, and Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense. He had heard stories, knew the warnings about strangers and dark nights and children who disappeared. But when the passenger window rolled down, the voice that called out was familiar. Marcus? Marcus Henderson! It was Mr. Jacobson, the man who delivered their mail and who lived 3 streets over with his wife and twin daughters. He had helped him carry packages when his back was acting up, had received dollar bills for Christmas and birthday cards addressed in his careful handwriting. "What in God's name are you doing out here, son?" Mr. Jacobson's voice carried the authority of an adult who was accustomed to being obeyed, but underneath it, Marcus could hear genuine worry. "Get in this car right now. You're soaked through." For a moment, Marcus considered running again. Mr. Jacobson was kind, but he was also an adult, which meant that he would ask questions Marcus didn't want to answer and make phone calls Marcus didn't want him to make. But the warmth radiating from the car's interior was like a physical presence, and Marcus realized he was shaking, not just from cold, but from exhaustion and fear, and the growing awareness that he might have made a terrible mistake. He climbed into the passenger seat, water puddling immediately on the upholstery. Mr. Jacobson reached across and cranked the heat up to full blast, then handed Marcus a towel from the back seat. "Dry your face," he said gently. "Then you're going to tell me what's going on." The kindness in his voice was almost worse than anger would have been. Anger Marcus could fight against, could use to fuel his resolve, but kindness made him feel young and foolish and desperately homesick for a place he had just spent the evening trying to escape. "I ran away," Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush. "I can't go back there. They don't want me." Mr. Jacobson was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could hear the rhythm of the windshield wipers and the steady drumming of rain on the car's roof. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Who doesn't want you, Marcus?" "Eleanor, my stepmother. She thinks I stole money from her purse, but I didn't. She never believes me about anything. She only cares about Lily, and my dad always takes her side, and I just—" His voice broke, and suddenly all the tears he had been holding back came flooding out. "I just want to go home, but I don't have a home anymore." Mr. Jacobson reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a pack of tissues, handing them to Marcus without comment. He waited while the boy cried, occasionally reaching over to adjust the heat or clear condensation from the windshields. Finally, when Marcus's sobs had subsided into hiccups, he spoke. "You know, Marcus, I've been delivering mail to your house for 3 years now. I see a lot of families in this neighborhood, and I've gotten pretty good at reading the signs of how they're doing." Marcus wiped his nose and waited. "Your house gets a lot of cards," Mr. Jacobson continued. "Birthday cards for you and Lily, thank you notes from your grandmother in Florida, postcards from your uncle in the Navy. But what I notice most is the care packages." "Care packages?" "Eleanor orders things for you kids all the time. Books she thinks you'll like, art supplies for Lily, clothes when you're growing too fast for what you have. She has them sent to my office instead of the house, and she always includes notes asking me to wrap them like they came from a secret admirer or a fairy godmother or something like that." Marcus stared at him, confusion replacing despair. "I don't understand." "I think Eleanor loves you kids more than she knows how to show. I think she's trying to take care of you in the only way she knows how, but maybe she's not very good at the day-to-day stuff. Some people aren't." The revelation hit Marcus like cold water. He thought about all the times mysterious gifts had appeared in his room. Books about subjects he was interested in, new school supplies that showed up just when he needed them, clothes that fit perfectly and were exactly his style. He had assumed his father was behind them, but now... "The money," he said slowly. "The $20 that was missing. What about it? What if she didn't lose it? What if she spent it on something for me or Lily and forgot?" Mr. Jacobson smiled sadly. "What if she did?" They sat in the warm car while the storm raged around them, and Marcus felt something shifting inside his chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the possibility of understanding. Eleanor wasn't the evil stepmother from fairy tales who delighted in making his life miserable. She was just a woman trying to build a family out of broken pieces, using tools she wasn't sure how to handle, making mistakes because perfection was impossible and love was complicated. "I think," Mr. Jacobson said gently, "you should probably go home now." Marcus nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "Will you take me?" "Of course I will." "But Marcus..." "Yes, sir?" "You're going to have to talk to them. Really talk. Not just about tonight, but about everything. Running away doesn't solve problems. It just moves them to a different place." As they drove through the rain-soaked streets toward Maple Street, Marcus pressed his face against the passenger window and watched the familiar landmarks slide by. Each streetlight, each mailbox, each carefully tended garden looked different somehow, not because they had changed, but because he was seeing them with new eyes. Maybe home wasn't a perfect place where everyone understood each other without effort. Maybe home was just a place where people cared enough to keep trying, even when they got it wrong more often than they got it right. Maybe family wasn't something you were born into or assigned to, but something you built, one conversation, one forgiveness, one small act of grace at a time. The house on Maple Street came into view, and Marcus was surprised to see that every light was on. The windows glowed like beacon fires, and even through the rain, he could see figures moving back and forth behind the glass. People who were awake in the middle of the night. People who had discovered he was gone and were doing something about it. "Looks like they noticed you were missing after all," Mr. Jacobson said quietly. As they pulled into the driveway, the front door opened, and Eleanor appeared on the porch. She wasn't dressed for company. Her hair was disheveled, her face was streaked with what might have been tears, and she was wearing the old robe she used for cleaning. When she saw Marcus getting out of the car, she ran down the steps without regard for the rain, her bare feet splashing through puddles as she reached for him. "Oh, Marcus," she said, her voice breaking as she pulled him into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, we were so worried. We were so scared." And there, standing in his driveway in the middle of a storm, being held by a woman who smelled like worry and relief and something that might have been love, Marcus finally understood what Mr. Jacobson had been trying to tell him. Home wasn't perfect, but it was his. The emergency room at County General Hospital hummed with the quiet efficiency of a place that never truly slept. Fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief. The scuffed linoleum floors, the plastic chairs arranged in neat rows, and the faces of people waiting for news about the ones they loved. It was 3:17 in the morning, according to the large clock mounted above the reception desk, and Marcus Henderson lay unconscious on a gurney in Trauma Bay 3, his small body looking even smaller beneath the white hospital sheets. The accident had happened so quickly that Marcus himself retained only fragments: the blinding sweep of headlights, the screech of brakes on wet pavement, the sensation of flying through space before everything went dark. Mr. Jacobson had been driving carefully, his hands steady on the wheel as they navigated the rain-slicked streets toward home when the other car had run the red light at the intersection of Maple and Oak. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. The other driver, a young nurse named Sarah Kim, who was heading home after a double shift, had been as careful as humanly possible given the conditions. But rain made everything dangerous, turning familiar roads into skating rinks and reducing visibility to mere suggestions of what lay ahead. Physics had taken over where good intentions left off, and the result was a 12-year-old boy with a concussion and a family that was about to learn what they meant to each other when the possibility of loss made everything else seem trivial. David Henderson had received the call at 2:43 a.m., jarring him from the restless sleep he'd been pretending to enjoy while his wife paced the floors downstairs, calling Marcus's name into empty rooms and checking his bedroom every 15 minutes as if he might have materialized back into his bed through sheer force of maternal worry. Eleanor had been standing at Marcus's bedroom window, staring out into the storm and mentally cataloging all the places a 12-year-old boy might go in the middle of the night when she heard David's sharp intake of breath from downstairs. She had known, with the intuitive certainty that comes from loving someone, that whatever news was traveling through those telephone wires was about Marcus. By the time David's footsteps were on the stairs, she was already reaching for her coat. They had driven to the hospital in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the careful quiet that had characterized so many of their interactions over the past 2 years. This was the silence of people who were too frightened to speak, too worried about tempting fate with premature relief or unnecessary panic. David's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap as she stared through the windshield at the rain that had somehow become the enemy, the element that had conspired to hurt the boy she was still learning how to love. The waiting room at County General had become a liminal space, where time moved differently and hope felt both fragile and fierce. David sat with his head in his hands, occasionally looking up to check the clock or scan the hallway for any sign of the doctor who would tell them whether Marcus was going to be okay. Eleanor had claimed the chair beside him, but she couldn't seem to stay still. She would sit for a few minutes, then stand to pace, then sit again, her nervous energy a physical manifestation of the anxiety that was eating her alive from the inside. "This is my fault," she had said suddenly, the words erupting from some deep well of guilt she had been trying to keep sealed. If things at home had been better, he wouldn't have run away. He wouldn't have been out there. David had looked up from his hands, seeing his wife clearly for perhaps the first time in months. Eleanor's face was streaked with tears she didn't seem to realize she was crying, and her normally perfect posture had collapsed under the weight of self-recrimination. "Eleanor, no," he had said, reaching for her hand. "This isn't your fault. This isn't anyone's fault." "But it is," she had insisted,
her voice rising with the desperation of someone who needed to be blamed, who needed this to be someone's fault because random accidents were too terrifying to contemplate. She had been trying so hard to do everything right, to be what you needed, what he needed, that I forgot how to just be. I forgot how to be human. The confession hung between them like a bridge, spanning 2 years of careful distance and accumulated misunderstandings. David had squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses she had developed from all the extra housework she did to prove her worth, all the effort she had poured into creating a perfect home for a family that never asked for perfection. "Tell me," he had said simply.
And so she had. Sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, Eleanor had finally said all the things she had been too proud or too scared to say before. She talked about how much she missed her own mother, who had died just 6 months before she met David, and how terrified she had been of trying to fill a space that had been shaped by someone else's love. She talked about how much Marcus reminded her of her first husband, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the stubborn set of his jaw when he felt cornered, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide beneath bravado and anger. "I was so afraid of not being good enough," she had whispered. "So afraid that if I wasn't strict enough, if I didn't maintain control, everything would fall apart and you'd realize you'd made a mistake. That Marcus would never accept me, that Lily would suffer for being caught between families, that I'd ruin everything I touched." David had pulled her close then, understanding flooding through him like revelation. All this time, he had been watching Eleanor try to be the perfect stepmother without realizing that perfection was the enemy of connection, that her efforts to avoid mistakes had prevented her from taking the risks that real relationships required. "He's going to be okay," David had said, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "And we're going to figure this out, all of us, together." When Dr. Martinez finally appeared in the waiting room doorway, her scrubs still bearing the evidence of a long night spent putting broken things back together, both David and Eleanor had risen from their chairs with the synchronized movement of people who had become a team without realizing it. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson? I'm Dr. Martinez. Marcus is going to be fine." The relief had been physical, a loosening of muscles they hadn't realized were tense, a return of breath they hadn't noticed they were holding. But Dr. Martinez had continued speaking, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had delivered both devastating news and miraculous reprieve. "He has a mild concussion and some bruising, but the CT scan shows no internal bleeding, no fractures. He's been awake and asking for you both. We're going to keep him overnight for observation, but he should be able to go home tomorrow afternoon." "Can we see him?" Eleanor had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. He's in room 314, but he's been through a trauma tonight, and he may be disoriented or emotional. Just be patient with him." The walk down the hospital corridor had felt eternal, each step carrying them toward a conversation that would either bring their family together or confirm that some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired. Eleanor had hesitated at the door to Marcus's room, suddenly terrified that he would look at her with blame or anger, or worse, indifference. But when they stepped inside, Marcus was sitting up in bed, his dark hair sticking up in places where it had dried against the pillow, his eyes bright and alert despite the bandage on his forehead. When he saw them, his face crumpled with relief and something that might have been shame. "I'm sorry," he had said immediately. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen."
Eleanor had moved to his bedside without thinking, her hand reaching out to smooth his hair in a gesture that was pure instinct, pure maternal love, unfiltered by anxiety or expectation. "Oh, sweetheart," she had said, her voice breaking, "you don't need to be sorry. I'm the one who should apologize. I've been so worried about being good enough for this family that I forgot to actually be part of it." What followed was the conversation they should have had 2 years ago, the one that fear and pride and accumulated hurt had prevented them from having. Marcus had talked about feeling invisible, about believing that Eleanor saw him as an obligation rather than a gift. Eleanor had shared her terror of replacing someone irreplaceable, her clumsy attempts to show love through rules and expectations because she didn't know how else to navigate the delicate territory of step-parenting. "I never wanted to take your mother's place," Eleanor had said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I just wanted to find my own place, somewhere between being a stranger and being... I don't know what I wanted to be." "You could just be Eleanor," Marcus had said with the simple wisdom that sometimes comes from 12-year-olds who have run out of energy for complicated emotions. "You don't have to be my mom, but you could be my Eleanor." David had watched from the corner of the room as his son and wife discovered each other, really discovered each other for the first time. They talked about the broken teacup, and Eleanor had explained that it had belonged to her grandmother, the only thing she had left from a woman who had raised her after her own parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. The cup hadn't just been china. It had been a connection to love and loss and the complicated geography of grief. "I wasn't angry at you for breaking it," Eleanor had said, her hand still smoothing Marcus's hair. "I was angry at myself for caring so much about something that couldn't love me back when I had real people right in front of me who needed me to figure out how to show them I cared." They talked about the missing $20, and Eleanor had laughed, actually laughed, as she remembered where it had gone. "I bought you new art supplies," she had said, "for your school project. You mentioned you needed better colored pencils, and I saw some at the store, and I wanted to surprise you, but then I forgot I had bought them, and when Lily needed money for her fundraiser, I couldn't remember where I'd put the cash I'd set aside." "The art supplies in my desk drawer," Marcus had said slowly. "The ones I thought Dad bought. Those were from me, along with the book about space exploration you found on your bed last month, and the new sneakers that appeared in your closet, and about a dozen other things. I kept hoping you'd ask who they were from, but you never did, so I figured you didn't care." The revelation had hit Marcus like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. All those mysterious gifts, all those small kindnesses he had attributed to his father or cosmic coincidence had been Eleanor's awkward attempts at connection. She had been trying to speak to him in the only language she knew, the language of provision and care, while he had been waiting for her to speak in the language his mother had used, the language of words and physical affection and obvious warmth. "I didn't know," Marcus had whispered. "I thought you just tolerated me because you had to." "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor had said, tears flowing freely now. "I love you. I've loved you since the day I met you, when you helped your dad carry in groceries and you insisted on carrying the heaviest bag even though it was almost as big as you were. I just didn't know how to tell you without feeling like I was trying to replace someone irreplaceable." The conversation had continued deep into the night, with nurses checking in periodically and finding the three of them huddled together like survivors of some natural disaster, which in a way they were. They were survivors of the storm that had been brewing in their house for 2 years, the pressure system of unspoken needs and misunderstood gestures that had finally broken open, washing away the careful distance they had maintained and leaving them raw and honest and together. Marcus had talked about feeling caught between loyalty to his mother's memory and the desire to have Eleanor's approval. Eleanor had shared her fear that loving Marcus fully would somehow diminish the love she had for Lily, as if love were a finite resource that had to be carefully rationed. David had admitted that he had been so focused on making sure everyone got along that he had forgotten to facilitate the kind of authentic connection that made getting along unnecessary. "We're going to do better," David had said, as dawn light began to creep through the hospital room windows. "All of us, we're going to stop tiptoeing around each other and start acting like the family we've been pretending to be." "It's going to be messy," Eleanor had warned, but she was smiling as she said it. "I'm not good at this. I'm going to make mistakes." "We all are," Marcus had replied, with the wisdom of a boy who had learned that perfection was the enemy of connection. Maybe making mistakes together is better than being perfect separately. When they finally brought Marcus home the next afternoon, the house on Maple Street looked different somehow. The same furniture occupied the same spaces, the same family photos lined the mantelpiece, but the atmosphere had been transformed by something as simple as honesty. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions had been replaced by something messier but infinitely more real. That first evening home, as they sat around the kitchen table, the same table that had witnessed so many silent meals, Eleanor made Marcus's favorite dinner without being asked, and Marcus helped Lily with her homework without being reminded, and David had actually laughed at something Lily said, instead of just smiling the careful smile he reserved for stepfamily interactions. "We should talk about rules," Eleanor had said, as they cleared the dishes. "Real rules, not the ones I made up because I was scared of not being strict enough." "Like what?" Marcus had asked. "Like family meetings. Once a week, we all sit down and talk about how we're doing, what's working, what isn't, and anyone can call an emergency meeting if something important comes up." "Can I call one now?" Lily had piped up from her seat at the counter. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Lily had looked around the table with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something important. "I just wanted to say that I'm glad Marcus didn't stay run away, and I'm glad Eleanor isn't scared to hug us anymore, and I'm glad Daddy isn't walking around like he's worried all the time." The simple honesty of an 8-year-old had cut through any remaining pretense, and Eleanor had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. "You know what?" she had said, standing up and opening her arms. "I think this family needs a group hug." Marcus had hesitated for just a moment, old habits dying hard, but then he had stepped into Eleanor's embrace, followed quickly by Lily and then David, and for the first time since they had all started living under the same roof, they had felt like they actually belonged together. The weeks that followed weren't perfect. Eleanor still struggled with showing affection in ways that felt natural to her, and Marcus still sometimes retreated into himself when he felt overwhelmed. David still occasionally forgot to really listen instead of just managing, and Lily still sometimes felt caught between her biological parent and the family they were all trying to build together. But they had established something that night in the hospital room, something that made the imperfections bearable. They had agreed to keep trying. They had committed to honesty over harmony, to authentic struggle over artificial peace. The family meetings became a weekly tradition, held every Sunday evening after dinner. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, chores and schedules, and who was responsible for what. Sometimes they talked about feelings, disappointments and celebrations, and the small hurts that could become big problems if left unaddressed. And sometimes they just use the time to appreciate each other, to say the things that families often think but don't always remember to speak out loud. 3 months after the accident, Marcus had surprised everyone by asking if he could legally change his name to Marcus Henderson Walsh, taking both his father's surname and Eleanor's maiden name. I don't want to give up being Dad's son, but I want people to know I'm Eleanor's son too. Eleanor had cried, happy tears this time, and had surprised herself by how much the gesture meant to her. She had spent so much time worrying about replacing Marcus's mother that she hadn't allowed herself to imagine being chosen by him, being claimed as family in a way that went beyond legal obligations and household arrangements. The photograph that now sat on the mantelpiece, replacing the carefully posed portrait from their wedding day, had been taken on a random Tuesday evening, 6 months later. They were all crowded around the kitchen table, helping Lily with a science project that had somehow turned into a family engineering challenge. Marcus had glue in his hair, Eleanor was covered in glitter, David was reading instructions upside down, and Lily was directing the whole operation with the authority of a general commanding troops. They looked, David thought as he studied the picture, exactly what they were. A family that had been assembled rather than born, constructed rather than inherited, but no less real for being deliberately chosen. They looked like people who had decided that love was something you did rather than something that happened to you, something you built one conversation and one forgiveness and one small act of grace at a time. The house on Maple Street had finally become a home, not perfect, but perfectly theirs. And on quiet evenings, when the 4 of them were scattered around the living room, reading or working on projects, or simply enjoying each other's company, Marcus would sometimes catch Eleanor's eye and smile, remembering the night he had run away from the only family he had left, and somehow, miraculously, run straight into the family he had been meant to find all along. The storm that had driven him out into the darkness had ultimately brought them all into the light, the warm, imperfect, beautifully complicated light of people who had learned that belonging wasn't about being perfect for each other, but about being honest enough to let themselves be loved despite their imperfections. And in the kitchen, the carefully glued teacup sat in a place of honor on the windowsill, its gold-filled cracks catching the afternoon sunlight like veins of precious metal, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things were the ones that had been broken and put back together with visible seams, stronger and more valuable for having survived the breaking.